The glass shattered against the wall, before Alina Whitfield could even open her mouth to explain herself. Bernard Whitfield stood in the center of the drawing room, his face red with a fury that had been building for years, not minutes. Behind him, the fireplace crackled, throwing orange light across the torn invitation lying on the floor, the one that had come back marked with a single cruel word written by Vincent Colebrook's own hand: unsuitable. "Do you understand what you have cost this family?" Bernard's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Do you understand what it means when a man like Colebrook refuses to even meet you?" Alina stood by the window, her hands folded tightly in front of her, refusing to let them shake. She was 26 years old, and she had heard this speech, or some version of it, more times than she could count. Her limp, the result of a fever that had nearly taken her life at the age of 9, had never healed properly. Her left leg dragged slightly when she walked, and a thin scar traced along her jaw where the same fever had left its mark. To the drawing rooms of London, these things made her invisible, or worse, an embarrassment. "I did nothing to cost this family anything, Father," she said quietly. "Mr. Colebrook did not want a wife who limped. That is not a fault I created." "It is a fault you carry," Bernard snapped, "and I am tired of carrying it with you." The words landed like a physical blow, though Alina did not flinch. She had trained herself over years not to flinch. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the window, toward the garden below, where a lone figure was still working in the fading evening light, digging a new bed for the winter roses. He worked alone, always alone, arriving before dawn and staying long after the other servants had gone in for supper. The staff called him Edward, and he had come to Whitfield House only 2 months earlier, hired quietly to replace the previous groundsman who had grown too old for the work. Alina did not know why she watched him. Perhaps it was because he never looked at her the way others did, with pity or disdain. In truth, he rarely looked at her at all, and when he did, his eyes held something she could not name, something careful and searching, as if he were solving a puzzle only he could see. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," Bernard demanded. Alina turned back to face her father. Behind him, her 2 younger sisters, Charlotte and Louisa, stood near the doorway, watching with the practiced blankness of girls who had learned long ago that it was safer not to take sides. Charlotte was 18, golden-haired, and already engaged to a baronet's son. Louisa was 16 and being groomed for a similar future. Neither of them said a word. "I have done everything a father could do," Bernard continued, pacing now, his boots striking hard against the floor. "I have spent money we do not have on gowns, on dinners, on introductions. And for what? For every door to close in my face because no gentleman in London wants a bride who cannot walk a ballroom floor without stumbling." "Then perhaps," Alina said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest, "you should stop trying to sell me to men who care more about how I walk than who I am." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. Bernard crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her by the wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make his meaning clear. "You will not speak to me with that tongue in this house," he said. "You are 26 years old, Alina, 26 and unmarried, and running out of seasons faster than any physician can count them. Do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I take pleasure in watching every mother in London whisper about my daughter behind her fan?" Alina pulled her wrist free, her eyes burning but her voice refusing to break. "No, Father. I think you take pleasure in nothing where I am concerned, except perhaps being rid of me." Bernard's jaw tightened. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something almost like shame, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath decades of pride and debt, and the crushing fear of being the last Whitfield of any consequence in a city that had already begun to forget his name. He turned toward the window instead, his gaze following hers down to the garden below, where the groundsman was still working, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, dirt on his hands, his dark hair falling loose over his brow. An idea, cruel and sudden, crossed Bernard's face. "If no gentleman in London will have you," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "then perhaps a gentleman is not what you deserve." Alina's stomach turned cold. "Father, what are you saying?" I am saying, Bernard replied, a bitter smile curling at the edge of his mouth, that a woman who cannot secure a proper match should be grateful for any match at all. There is a groundsman in my employ who has neither name nor fortune to lose. He will take what is given to him and be thankful for it. You cannot be serious. Eleanor's voice rose for the first time, panic breaking through her composure. You would hand your own daughter to a servant, a stranger, simply to spite the men who rejected me. I would hand my daughter to anyone who will finally take her off my hands, Bernard said coldly. Better a groundsman's wife than a spinster daughter whispered about in every parlor in the city. Charlotte gasped softly from the doorway. Louisa said nothing, her eyes wide. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she had not moved an inch. She wanted to scream, to argue, to remind her father that she was a person and not a debt to be settled, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with years of swallowed hurt. Outside, unaware of the storm being decided above him, Edward straightened from his work and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He glanced up at the house, almost as if he had felt the weight of the conversation happening behind the glass, and for one strange moment, his eyes met Eleanor's through the window. He did not look away. Neither did she. There was something steady in his gaze, something that did not carry the judgment she was used to seeing reflected back at her. It unsettled her more than her father's anger had. You will not do this, Eleanor said, turning back to Bernard, her voice trembling now despite her best efforts. I am not a parcel to be handed off to whichever man is standing closest when your patience runs out. You are my daughter, Bernard said, and you will do as I say, or you may find yourself with no roof over your head at all. Consider carefully which fate you prefer. The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. Eleanor looked at her sisters, hoping for even a flicker of support, but Charlotte's eyes were fixed on the floor, and Louisa had already turned away, unwilling to witness what was coming. Eleanor was alone in this, as she had always been. She thought of the groundsman below, a man whose name she barely knew, whose life she knew nothing about, a stranger her father intended to bind her to as if she were nothing more than an unwanted piece of furniture being given away. Fear rose in her chest, sharp and immediate, but beneath it something else stirred as well, something she did not yet have a name for. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Eleanor sat by her window and watched the small cottage at the edge of the garden, where a single candle burned behind a thin curtain. She did not know yet that the man inside that cottage was about to change the entire course of her life. She did not know that the ragged clothes he wore during the day hid a truth so enormous it would one day shake the foundations of two great houses. All she knew in that moment was that her father had made a decision about her future without asking a single question about what she wanted, and that somehow, impossibly, she found herself more curious about the quiet stranger in the garden than afraid of the life her father intended to force upon her. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and whispered to no one, "What have you done to us both, father?" Below, the candle in the cottage window flickered once, and then went dark, as if the man inside had been listening all along. The morning arrived gray and unwelcoming, fog curling low over the gardens of Whitfield House, as if the sky itself wished to hide what was about to happen. Eleanor had not slept. She had spent the night pacing her room, rehearsing arguments she knew her father would not hear, imagining escapes she knew she could not make. By the time the maid came to dress her, Eleanor's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and her hands would not stop trembling as the woman fastened the buttons of a plain gray gown, one entirely unsuited for what her father had promised would be a wedding. "You needn't look so frightened, miss," the maid, a kind older woman named Peggy, murmured as she worked. "Perhaps it will not be as bad as you fear." "My father is handing me to a stranger, Peggy," Eleanor said flatly. "I fail to see how that could be anything but as bad as I fear." Peggy said nothing further, though her eyes softened with a pity Eleanor had long grown tired of receiving. Downstairs, Bernard Whitfield was already dressed in his finest coat, pacing the entrance hall with the restless energy of a man closing a business deal rather than arranging his daughter's future. He had sent word to the local parish the night before, calling in a favor from a vicar who owed him money and would ask no questions. There would be no guests, no celebration, no flowers, only the necessary witnesses and the necessary signatures. Charlotte and Louisa waited near the staircase, dressed modestly, their faces pale. Neither had spoken to Alina since the previous evening. Alina could not decide if it was guilt or fear that kept their mouths shut, and in the end, she decided it did not matter. She had learned long ago not to expect rescue from anyone in this house. "You look presentable enough," Bernard said when Alina descended the stairs, his tone clipped and businesslike, as though commenting on the quality of a horse rather than the appearance of his own daughter. "Come, we mustn't keep the vicar waiting." "And the groom?" Alina asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Does he know what is being decided for him this morning, or is he as much a prisoner of your temper as I am?" Bernard's eyes narrowed. "He has been informed," he accepted. "How generous of him," Alina said bitterly, "to accept a wife he has never spoken to." "Careful, Alina," Bernard warned. "You would do well to remember that this arrangement is far kinder than the alternative I offered you last night." Alina said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. She followed her father out into the misty morning, her legs carrying her forward though every part of her wanted to run in the opposite direction. The small stone chapel at the edge of the estate had not seen a wedding in years. Its wooden pews were dusty, its windows clouded with age, and the vicar who waited inside looked as uncomfortable with the arrangement as Alina felt. But it was the man standing near the altar that made Alina stop entirely in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Edward stood alone, dressed in the same plain clothes he wore for garden work, though someone, perhaps out of some small mercy, had given him a clean shirt for the occasion. His dark hair had been combed back, and though his hands, roughened by labor, were folded in front of him, there was nothing nervous or uncertain in his posture. He stood straight, calm, almost unnervingly composed for a man about to marry a woman he had likely never exchanged more than a passing word with. He turned as she entered, and their eyes met for the second time in 2 days. There was no pity in his gaze, no mockery, no triumph at having secured, however strangely, a bride so far above his station. Instead, there was something quiet and steady, something that almost resembled understanding, as though he too recognized the injustice of the moment but had decided, for reasons of his own, not to fight it. "You do not have to do this," Alina whispered as she reached the altar, low enough that only he could hear. "If you refuse, my father cannot force either of us." Edward's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something thoughtful. "And if I refuse," he said quietly, his voice low and even, carrying none of the roughness she expected from a man who spent his days in the dirt, "what becomes of you?" Alina faltered, unprepared for the question. "That is not your concern." "It is now," Edward said simply, and turned to face the vicar. The ceremony was brief, stripped of every tradition that made a wedding feel like a celebration rather than a transaction. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond Bernard and the vicar's assistant standing as witnesses. The vows were spoken plainly, without warmth, and Alina found herself repeating words she did not feel, promising a lifetime to a man whose full name she did not even know. When it came time to exchange rings, there was a brief, awkward pause. Bernard had provided nothing for the occasion, having not thought so far ahead, or perhaps not caring to. Edward reached into his coat pocket and produced a simple gold band, plain and unadorned, but clearly of fine craftsmanship, far finer than anything a groundsman's wages could afford. Alina stared at it, a flicker of confusion crossing her face, but before she could voice a question, Edward had already slipped it onto her finger, his touch gentle, almost reverent, nothing like the rough handling she had braced herself for. "Where did a groundsman come by a ring such as this?" she murmured, too quiet for the vicar to hear. "A gift," Edward said simply, offering no further explanation, "from someone who once believed I would need it." The vicar pronounced them married before Alina could press further, and just like that, the life she had known ended, replaced by one she did not understand at all. Outside the chapel, Bernard did not linger for congratulations or embraces. He shook Edward's hand briskly, more out of habit than warmth, and turned to Alina with an expression that held no triumph, only relief, the relief of a burden finally lifted from his shoulders. "You will move into the cottage by the garden," he said. "I trust you understand there is no place for you here any longer." Alina looked at the house she had grown up in, the home that had never truly felt like one, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt very little at the thought of leaving it. "I understand perfectly, father," she said quietly. Bernard nodded once, satisfied, and walked back toward the house without another word, already turning his mind toward whatever business awaited him next. Charlotte offered a small, uncertain wave from the doorway. Louisa did not look back at all. Alina stood alone in the misty morning beside a man she had married and did not know, watching her father disappear into the house that had never loved her, and felt, for the first time in years, a strange and terrifying kind of freedom. "I imagine," Edward said gently, breaking the silence, "that this is not the morning you dreamed of as a girl." "No," Alina admitted, a bitter laugh escaping her despite herself. "I dreamed of many things. A groundsman husband handed to me out of spite was never among them." "Then perhaps," Edward said, and for the first time something like warmth touched his voice, "we shall have to build something better than either of us dreamed." Alina studied him carefully, searching his face for signs of mockery or resentment, but found none. Only calm and patience, and a quiet kind of strength that unsettled her far more than her father's cruelty ever had. "You are a strange man," she said finally. "You have no idea," Edward replied, and though his tone remained light, something flickered behind his eyes, something guarded and old, a secret carried carefully beneath the surface of an ordinary face. He offered her his arm, roughened hands and all, and after a long moment of hesitation, Alina took it. Together they walked toward the small cottage at the edge of the garden, toward a life neither of them had chosen, but one that neither of them, in that quiet gray morning, seemed entirely willing to run from. Behind them, the chapel bells rang once, faint and hollow across the misty fields, marking a marriage that had begun in cruelty but carried within it, unseen and unspoken, the first fragile threads of something neither Alina nor Edward yet understood. Neither of them could have known, standing there in the fog with the weight of a forced marriage settling over their shoulders, that within the walls of a distant estate called Ravenhall, an old duchess lay waiting for news of her missing son, a son the entire aristocracy believed had vanished from society 2 years earlier, never suspecting that he had been living quietly among them all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a reason to become himself again. That reason was walking beside him now, her hand resting lightly on his arm, utterly unaware that she had just become a duchess without a single soul in the world knowing it, including herself. The cottage was smaller than anything Alina had ever lived in, a single room downstairs with a narrow staircase leading to a loft bedroom above, the walls made of rough stone, the roof patched in places where the previous groundsman had never bothered with repairs. Yet as Alina stepped through the low doorway on her first evening as a married woman, she found herself oddly struck by how clean it was, how carefully arranged, as though someone had spent considerable time preparing it despite having so little time to do so. A fire had already been lit in the small hearth. A kettle sat warming beside it. On the single wooden table, someone had placed a small vase with a handful of wildflowers, an unexpected touch of gentleness in a home built from necessity rather than choice. "You did this?" Alina asked, glancing at Edward, who stood near the doorway, watching her reaction carefully. "I thought," he said, a note of uncertainty entering his otherwise steady voice, "that you might prefer a hearth that was already warm to one you had to build yourself, given everything else that has been decided for you without your consent today." Alina said nothing for a long moment, studying the small, careful kindness laid out before her. It was such a simple thing, a fire, a kettle, flowers picked from wherever he had found them growing wild along the estate walls, and yet it was more consideration than her own father had shown her in years. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. Edward nodded once, and an awkward silence settled between them, the silence of two strangers standing in a small room, bound together by law and circumstance rather than affection or choice. "I imagine you have questions," Edward said eventually, moving to the hearth to check the kettle, giving his hands something to do. "Several," Alina admitted, sitting carefully at the small table, her bad leg aching from the tension of the day. "Though I suspect you will not answer most of them." "Try me," he said, surprising her. Alina considered carefully. There were so many questions crowding her mind, questions about the ring, about his manner of speech, about the way he carried himself despite his rough clothing, but she began with the simplest one. "Where are you from, Edward? You do not speak like a groundsman." Something flickered across his face, quick and guarded. "I have traveled a great deal," he said, "and picked up habits from places that were not my own. It is easier sometimes to sound like someone you are not than to explain who you actually are." "That is not an answer," Alina said. "No," Edward agreed, pouring the tea, "it is not, but it is all I can offer you tonight." Alina studied him, frustration mixing with a curiosity she could not quite suppress. There was something in the careful way he chose his words, something deliberate, as though every sentence had been weighed before it left his mouth. It was not the manner of a simple man. "Very well," she said, deciding not to push further, at least not yet. "Then perhaps you will answer this instead. Why did you agree to marry me? My father offered you nothing but a cottage you likely could have earned through honest work eventually. Why accept a stranger as a wife for so little gain?" Edward set the teacup in front of her, his movements careful, and took the seat across from her, the small table barely wide enough to separate them. "Because I watched you in that garden for 2 months," he said, his voice quieter now, more honest than anything he had said all day. "Long before your father decided to use you as a weapon against the men who wronged you. I watched you tend to flowers that had been trampled by careless guests, watched you speak kindly to servants that your own sisters treated as furniture, watched you sit alone at the edge of parties you were too proud to hide from despite the whispers. And I thought, whoever wins the heart of that woman will win something far more valuable than his title or fortune could ever measure." Alina's breath caught in her throat. Whatever answer she had expected, it was not this. "You watched me," she repeated slowly, "and decided based on that alone to marry me." "I decided," Edward said, "that a marriage forced by cruelty did not have to remain cruel forever. What we build from this moment forward, Alina, is entirely up to us. Your father made a decision out of spite. I choose, every day going forward, to make a different one." Alina did not know how to respond to that. She had spent so many years bracing herself against disappointment, against rejection, against the quiet cruelty of a world that judged her by a limp and a scar rather than the person underneath, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who expected nothing from her in return. "You are either the strangest man I have ever met," she said finally, "or the kindest. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps," Edward said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something close to a smile, "I am simply a man who has learned, through difficult means, that kindness costs nothing and is worth everything." They sat together in the small cottage as the fire burned low, speaking of small things now: the garden, the flowers Alina loved best, the books she had read in secret during long afternoons when her father believed her occupied with needlework. Edward listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried a thoughtfulness that Alina had never encountered in the drawing rooms of London, where conversation was a performance rather than a genuine exchange. Over the following weeks, a fragile routine began to form between them. Alina woke early, no longer confined to the rigid schedule of a household that had never truly wanted her, and found herself drawn to the garden Edward tended so carefully. At first, she watched from the cottage doorway, unsure of her place in his work. But Edward, noticing her interest, began explaining what he was doing: the proper way to prune roses so they would bloom fuller in spring, the trick of turning soil to keep it rich through winter, the patience required to grow something worth keeping. "You have a gift for this," he told her one morning, watching her carefully replant a bed of struggling lavender with hands that had grown steadier and more confident with each passing week. "I have never been allowed to have a gift for anything," Alina admitted, sitting back on her heels, dirt smudged across her palms. "My father always said accomplishments were wasted on a woman no man would marry." "Your father," Edward said, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard from him before, "was wrong about a great many things." Alina glanced up at him, surprised by the sudden intensity in his tone. "You speak as though you have some authority to judge him." "Perhaps I simply recognize cruelty when I see it," Edward said, softening again, "and recognize even more clearly when it has been aimed at someone who did nothing to deserve it." It was in these small moments, scattered throughout ordinary days, that Alina began to notice things about her husband that did not fit the life he claimed to lead. His hands, though roughened from labor, moved with a precision that suggested years of training in something far more delicate than gardening. Once she caught him reading by candlelight late into the night, a heavy book bound in leather, and when she asked what he was reading, he closed it quickly and answered vaguely about agricultural techniques, though the book's spine had borne no such title she could see. Another evening, a letter arrived for him, delivered by a rider on a fine horse that seemed entirely out of place on the narrow lane leading to their small cottage. Edward read it by the fire, his expression unreadable, and then fed it directly into the flames without a word of explanation. Alina watched the paper curl and blacken, questions rising in her throat that she did not yet have the courage to ask aloud. "Who sends you letters delivered by riders on such fine horses?" she asked instead, unable to fully contain her curiosity. "An old friend," Edward said simply, "checking on matters I once left unfinished." "And you burn every letter he sends." "Some matters," Edward said, his voice carrying a weight she did not understand, "are better left to ash than answered." Alina did not press further, though the mystery of her husband grew heavier in her mind with each passing week. There was a gentleness in him that she had never encountered in any man, a patience with her limp that never once slid into pity, a way of looking at her scar as though it were simply another part of her rather than a flaw to be overlooked. He never rushed her, never demanded more of her than she was willing to give, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, the space between them began to soften into something that resembled genuine companionship. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the sky within minutes, rain hammering against the cottage roof in a downpour neither of them had anticipated. Within moments, water began dripping steadily through a gap in the thatching directly above the small table, and Edward rushed to gather buckets while Alina scrambled to move their few belongings out of the widening puddle. "This roof has needed repair since before I arrived," Edward muttered, setting a bucket beneath the worst of the leak, only for a second gap to open moments later on the opposite side of the room. Alina, soaked from her efforts to save a stack of books from the rising water, could not help but laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that startled even herself. "What is so amusing about our roof collapsing around us?" Edward asked, though there was no real irritation in his voice, only a curious warmth as he watched her laugh for what might have been the first time since he had known her. "Nothing," Alina managed between breaths, gesturing at the chaos of buckets and dripping water surrounding them. "Everything. I have never seen a home fall apart so spectacularly, and yet, somehow, this is the happiest I believe I have been in years." Edward paused, water dripping from his hair, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and tenderness. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "a leaking roof is a fair price to pay for happiness." They spent the rest of the storm working together, laughing more than either had expected, moving buckets and blankets in a chaotic dance that left them both soaked and breathless by the time the rain finally eased. When at last they sat by the fire to dry, exhausted and smiling, Edward reached out and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from Alina's face, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Alina," he said softly, his voice carrying a seriousness that cut through the lightness of the evening. "There is something I must tell you, something I have been avoiding since the day we married." Aliner's heart quickened, sensing finally that the mystery she had been chasing for weeks was about to reveal itself. "Then tell me," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Whatever it is, Edward, I believe I am ready to hear it." But before he could speak another word, the sound of hooves thundered up the narrow lane outside, sharp and urgent even through the fading rain, and Edward's expression shifted instantly from tenderness to something guarded and alert, the calm mask he had worn for 2 months beginning, at last, to crack. "Not tonight," he murmured, almost to himself, rising quickly and moving toward the window. "Please, not tonight." Aliner watched him carefully, confusion and worry knotting together in her chest as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, unmistakably heading straight for their small, leaking cottage at the edge of the Whitfield estate. The rider who dismounted outside the cottage was not dressed like a farmhand or a messenger boy sent from the village. He wore a fine gray coat with silver buttons, polished boots unmarked by mud despite the storm, and he carried himself with the stiff formality of a man accustomed to serving households far grander than the Whitfield estate. Edward opened the door before the man could knock, stepping outside quickly, as though trying to keep whatever conversation followed away from Aliner's ears. But the cottage walls were thin, and the wind carried fragments of urgent words through the gap beneath the door. "Cannot wait any longer, sir. She is asking for you by name every single day." "Told you, Finch, I made a choice and I intend to keep it." "She does not have the luxury of your convictions, not anymore, not with her health as it stands." Aliner rose from her seat by the fire, moving quietly toward the window, her earlier laughter forgotten entirely. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see Edward standing rigid in the mud, his shoulders tense in a way she had never witnessed before, listening to the rider with an expression of controlled anguish. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough. Health, asking for him by name. A cold, uncertain fear crept into her chest, one she did not entirely understand. Was there another woman in Edward's life, someone he had left behind before their forced marriage, someone whose health was now failing while he remained hidden away tending gardens for a family that had never truly valued him? When Edward finally returned inside, soaked once more from the rain, his expression had shifted entirely from the warmth of moments before. Something heavier had settled over him, something Aliner recognized instantly as grief held carefully in check. "Who was that man?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "And who is asking for you?" Edward closed the door behind him slowly, as though buying himself time to choose his words with the same careful precision he applied to everything else. "His name is Gerald Finch," he said finally. "He serves a household I once belonged to before circumstances led me here." "And the woman he spoke of?" Edward's jaw tightened. "My mother," he said quietly. "She is unwell, and has been for some months, though the news he brings tonight suggests her condition has worsened considerably." Relief and guilt washed over Aliner in equal measure, relief that there was no hidden woman waiting in his past, guilt for having assumed the worst so quickly. "Edward, I am so sorry. You must go to her, of course. Family should not be kept waiting during such difficult times, regardless of whatever circumstances separated you." "It is not so simple," Edward said, sitting heavily at the table, his head bowed. "If I return to her, Aliner, everything changes. Everything you believe about the man you married will be proven false in an instant, and I fear you will hate me for the deception, however unintentional it began." Aliner's heart pounded. Whatever secret he had been carrying since the day of their wedding, it seemed the storm outside had finally forced it to the surface, whether either of them was ready or not. "Edward," she said carefully, sitting across from him, "you have shown me nothing but kindness since the day my father forced us together. Whatever truth you are hiding, I would rather hear it from you tonight than continue living beside a stranger I only partially understand." Edward looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes, fear, not of her judgment exactly, but of losing the fragile, honest connection they had built over the past 2 months. A connection built entirely on her believing him to be someone far simpler than he truly was. "My name," he said slowly, "is not Edward Hartley." Eleanor's breath caught, though she said nothing, waiting. "My full name is Alexander Ashworth," he continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was revealing. "And the household Gerald Finch serves, the household my mother waits in even now, gravely unwell, is Ravenhall." The name meant nothing to Eleanor at first, and then, slowly, recognition dawned, cold and disbelieving. Ravenhall was not simply a household. It was one of the great ducal seats of England, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones in every drawing room she had ever been forced to sit in, home to a family whose lineage stretched back centuries, whose current head had vanished from society nearly 2 years earlier under circumstances no one had ever fully explained. "You are telling me," Eleanor said slowly, disbelief creeping into every word, "that you are the missing Duke of Ravenhall." "Yes," Alexander said simply. The single word landed in the small cottage like a thunderclap, louder somehow than the storm still raging outside. Eleanor stared at the man across the table, the man she had married believing him a penniless groundsman, the man whose calloused hands had tended roses and mended leaking roofs, and held her gently through weeks of growing trust, and found herself utterly unable to reconcile that image with the title he had just claimed. "That is not possible," she said finally, though even as she spoke the words, pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The fine gold ring he had produced from nowhere on their wedding day, the careful, educated way he spoke despite his rough clothing, the letters delivered by riders on fine horses, the precision in his hands that no ordinary laborer could have possessed. "I assure you," Alexander said quietly, "it is entirely possible and entirely true." "Then explain it to me," Eleanor demanded, her voice rising now, fear and confusion, and something dangerously close to betrayal tangling together in her chest. "Explain to me why a duke would abandon his estate, his title, his entire life, to work as a groundsman in my father's garden and marry a woman he had no obligation to marry at all." Alexander rose slowly from the table, moving toward the small window, watching the rain continue its assault against the glass as he gathered his thoughts. "2 years ago," he began, "my mother, the Dowager Duchess, decided it was time for me to marry, not for love but for advantage, to a woman chosen entirely for her family's connections and fortune. I refused. We argued bitterly, and in my anger, I made a foolish, impulsive decision. I left Ravenhall in the middle of the night, determined to live as an ordinary man until I found someone who could care for me without knowing my title, without calculating what my name and fortune might offer them." "And you believed," Eleanor said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, cold and sharp, "that marrying a woman labeled unmarriageable, a woman handed to you out of spite by a desperate father, would satisfy that foolish vow of yours." "No," Alexander said, turning back to face her, his eyes intense and pleading in a way she had never seen from him before. "I did not marry you to satisfy a vow, Eleanor. I told you already, I watched you for 2 months before your father ever proposed this arrangement. I chose you, not because circumstances forced my hand, but because I had already decided long before that night that I wanted to know you, truly know you, without either of us being burdened by what my name would mean. And instead," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with a hurt she could not fully articulate, "you burdened me with a lie. Every conversation we shared, every moment I believed I was beginning to understand you, was built on a foundation you knew to be false." "I did not lie to protect myself," Alexander said, moving closer, though Eleanor took a step back, needing distance to think clearly. "I lied to protect the truth of what was growing between us, to give it a chance to exist without the weight of my title crushing it before it had even begun." "That is not protection, Alexander," Eleanor said, using his true name for the first time, the syllables feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. "That is deception, however gently intended. You allowed me to believe I was building something honest with a groundsman, when in truth I was being courted, quietly and secretly, by a duke who had already decided, long before I had any say in the matter, that I would be his experiment in finding a love untainted by his fortune. "You were never an experiment," Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time. "Alina, please, whatever you believe of me now, know that everything I have felt these past weeks has been entirely real." But Alina was already moving toward the stairs, her mind reeling, unable to separate the tenderness of the man she had come to trust from the enormity of the deception he had just confessed. "I need time," she said quietly, refusing to look back at him. "Your mother is unwell and needs you at Ravenhall. Go to her, Alexander. I will remain here, and when you return, if you return, perhaps I will have found some way to understand what has happened between us." "Alina, please," she said, her voice breaking at last, the composure she had maintained through years of her father's cruelty finally giving way beneath the weight of this new, unexpected wound. "I cannot look at you tonight without seeing every conversation we shared through the lens of what you have just told me. Go to your mother. I need to be alone with what remains of the man I believed I had married." Alexander stood silently for a long moment, grief and understanding warring across his face, before finally nodding once, gathering his coat from beside the door. He paused before stepping back out into the storm, looking back at Alina one final time. "Whatever you decide, Alina," he said quietly, "know that the man who tended your garden, who listened to you speak of the books you loved, who watched you laugh during a storm not so different from this one, that man was never a disguise. That man was always simply me, title or no title, and I hope, in time, you will come to believe that as fully as I do." He left without waiting for a response, disappearing into the rain toward the waiting rider, and Alina sat alone in the small cottage, the fire burning low, the truth of her marriage settling heavily around her like the storm still raging outside, uncertain whether she had married a stranger's lie or discovered, however painfully, the truth of a man who had simply wanted, for once in his privileged life, to be loved for nothing more than himself. Word of a duke's disappearance being solved traveled faster than any storm, and it reached Bernard Whitfield's ears within 3 days, carried first as a rumor from a stable boy who had overheard Gerald Finch speaking with the local innkeeper, then confirmed by a letter from a solicitor requesting formal documentation of the marriage between Alina Whitfield and the man known publicly as Edward Hartley. Bernard read the letter twice, then a third time, his hands trembling not with anger this time, but with a dawning, disbelieving excitement that turned his stomach even as it quickened his pulse. The groundsman he had thrown at his unmarriageable daughter out of spite, the man he had considered barely worth the cottage he offered as payment, was the Duke of Ravenhall. He arrived at the small cottage the following morning, dressed in his finest coat despite the early hour, his expression arranged into something he clearly believed resembled fatherly concern. "Alina," he said warmly, stepping through the door without waiting for an invitation, "my dear girl, why did you not tell me the truth of your husband's identity? Do you understand what this means for our family?" Alina, seated by the cold hearth, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the mild morning, looked up at her father with an expression of quiet, exhausted disbelief. "I did not know the truth myself, father, until the very night his identity was revealed. And even now, I fail to see how his title changes anything about the man I married 3 months ago, believing him to be nothing more than a servant." "It changes everything," Bernard said, pacing the small room with barely contained energy, entirely oblivious to the pain still evident on his daughter's face. "You are a duchess, Alina. Do you understand? A duchess. Every door that closed to you in London will now open without question. Every whisper about your limp, your scar, your age, will be silenced the moment society learns you are married to Alexander Ashworth." "I care nothing for silenced whispers, father," Alina said, her voice tight with a frustration that had been building since the night of the storm. "I care that my husband allowed me to believe a lie for months, and that you, upon learning the truth, care more about the title attached to my marriage than the fact that your daughter's heart has been left in confusion and hurt." Bernard paused his pacing, studying her with an expression that shifted briefly into something almost like genuine concern, before hardening once more into calculation. Whatever hurt you feel, Alina, you would do well to set it aside quickly. A man does not become a duke overnight, and a duke does not remain patient forever with a wife who withholds forgiveness over matters as trivial as a hidden name. Trivial, Alina repeated, standing now, her limp barely noticeable beneath the sharp movement of her anger. You believe a lie sustained across months of marriage is trivial. I believe, Bernard said firmly, that you would be a fool to let pride cost you the greatest fortune this family has ever been offered. Write to him, Alina. Summon him back. Reconcile whatever it takes and secure your place at Ravenhall before some other family finds a way to interfere. Alina stared at her father, and in that moment, something inside her that had bent for 26 years beneath the weight of his expectations finally, quietly, broke free. Get out, she said. Bernard blinked, startled. I beg your pardon. Get out of this cottage, Alina repeated, her voice steady now, stronger than she had ever spoken to him before. You handed me to a stranger out of spite 3 months ago, believing him worthless, and now that fortune has smiled upon that same stranger, you arrive at my door demanding I set aside my own feelings for the sake of your ambitions. I will not do it, father. Whatever I decide about my marriage, I will decide it for myself, not for your benefit. Alina, get out, she said a third time, and something in her tone, cold and final, convinced Bernard that further argument would gain him nothing that morning. He left, muttering about ingratitude and foolish pride, and Alina closed the door behind him with hands that trembled, though whether from anger or long overdue liberation, she could not entirely say. The weeks that followed passed slowly, marked by a quiet Alina had never experienced before, free now from her father's constant presence, yet equally free from the companionship she had grown unexpectedly attached to during her brief marriage to the man she had known as Edward. She tended the garden alone, finding a strange comfort in the work, in the soil beneath her fingernails, in the roses that continued blooming regardless of the turmoil surrounding the woman who cared for them. Letters began arriving from Ravenhall roughly once a week, each one carrying Alexander's careful, precise handwriting, though Alina left the first 3 unopened, stacked on the small table beside the vase of wildflowers that had long since wilted. It was Peggy, the maid who had dressed her on the morning of her wedding, and had since taken to visiting the cottage with small gifts of bread and news from the main house, who finally convinced her to read them. Whatever wrong he has done you, miss, Peggy said gently one afternoon, setting a fresh loaf on the table beside the unopened letters. A man who writes so faithfully, week after week, without ever demanding a reply, is not a man entirely without conscience. Alina stared at the small stack of letters for a long time after Peggy left, torn between the hurt that still lingered and a curiosity she had not yet managed to extinguish. Finally, with hands that trembled slightly, she opened the first. The letter contained no demands, no pleas for forgiveness, no attempts to justify the deception that had ended their fragile happiness so abruptly. Instead, it spoke simply of his mother, the Dowager Duchess, whose health had continued to decline despite the physician's best efforts, and of the strange, uncomfortable process of reacquainting himself with a household and a title he had abandoned 2 years earlier. The staff look at me as though I am a ghost returned from the dead, he wrote. And in truth, some days I feel as though I am exactly that, a man wearing the shape of someone I no longer recognize, longing quietly for the small cottage and the leaking roof, and the woman who laughed so freely during a storm that should have ruined our evening entirely. Alina read the letter twice, then set it carefully aside and opened the second, and then the third, each one revealing more of the quiet, careful man she had come to know during their months together. A man clearly struggling beneath the weight of a title he had never wanted, grieving a mother whose relationship with him had been strained long before his disappearance, and missing, achingly, a life he had briefly tasted and lost through his own concealed truth. Over the following weeks, Alina found herself reading each new letter as soon as it arrived, though she still did not write back, uncertain what words could possibly bridge the distance that had opened between them. The letters spoke of small things mostly, the roses at Ravenhall that never seemed to bloom as beautifully as the ones Elinor tended, the strange formality of servants who addressed him with titles he no longer felt he deserved, the quiet grief of watching his mother grow weaker, despite every effort to ease her suffering. Then, nearly 2 months after Alexander's departure, a final letter arrived, shorter than the others and different in tone entirely. "My mother passed peacefully 3 nights ago," it read. "I will not pretend our relationship was without its difficulties, but I grieve her nonetheless and find myself, in this strange new quiet, thinking constantly of the woman who once sat with me through a storm and taught me, without ever intending to, what it means to be cared for honestly rather than strategically. I do not write today to ask for your forgiveness, Elinor, though I hope for it more than I can adequately express. I write only to tell you that the cottage taught me what home means, and that you, in your kindness and your honesty and your refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are, taught me what love means. Both remain yours whenever and however you choose to claim them." Elinor sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, tears she had not expected slipping silently down her cheeks. Outside, the garden she had tended alone for 2 months swayed gently in the evening breeze, roses in full bloom despite the turmoil of the season, a quiet testament to the care she had poured into something that had, despite everything, continued to grow. She thought of her father's cruelty, of the men who had rejected her in London ballrooms, of the years spent believing herself unworthy of genuine affection, simply because society had decided her limp, and her scar made her less than whole. And she thought of Alexander, of the quiet, patient man who had watched her from a distance for 2 months before ever speaking a word, who had chosen her not out of obligation, but out of something that had grown, slowly and honestly, into a connection neither of them had fully anticipated. The deception still hurt, and she suspected it would continue to hurt for some time yet. But beneath that hurt, she recognized now, was something that had never been false at all. The gentleness in his hands as he mended their leaking roof, the patience in his eyes as he taught her to prune roses, the honesty in his voice the night he had finally revealed the truth, however painfully delayed that revelation had been. Elinor rose from the table, walked to the small writing desk in the corner of the cottage, and for the first time in 2 months began to write back. The carriage that arrived at Ravenhall 3 weeks later carried a passenger no one had invited, and everyone had feared might eventually come. Lady Isabel Voss stepped down from the polished vehicle with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life being admired, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the long journey, her expression carrying the confident certainty of someone who believed a great injustice was finally about to be corrected. Alexander was in the study when the housekeeper announced her arrival, and he set down his pen with a weariness that had little to do with the estate paperwork spread across his desk. "Tell her I am occupied," he said, though he already suspected the request would do little good. It did not. Isabel swept into the study moments later, brushing past the housekeeper's protests entirely, her eyes bright with an emotion that might have once passed for affection, but now, to Alexander's eyes, carried only calculation. "Alexander," she said warmly, as though no time at all had passed since their engagement had been arranged 2 years earlier, the very arrangement he had fled in the middle of the night rather than accept. "I heard the news the moment it reached London. The lost Duke of Ravenhall returned at last. I came as quickly as I could." "Isabel," Alexander said carefully, rising from his desk, "I am afraid whatever news reached you was incomplete. I have returned, yes, but I have also married." Something flickered across Isabel's face, quickly smoothed into practiced composure. "Yes, I heard something of that as well. A groundsman's marriage arranged in haste by a desperate father to secure his daughter's future. Surely, Alexander, now that your true identity has been revealed, the arrangement can be quietly dissolved. Such marriages happen more often than society admits, and are unmade just as easily when circumstances change." "The circumstances have not changed in the way you imagine," Alexander said, his voice hardening. "I did not marry Elinor Whitfield out of desperation or convenience. I chose her, deliberately before either of us knew the truth of my identity, and I intend to remain married to her for the whole of my life." Isabel's composure cracked slightly, genuine surprise and irritation flashing across her features. "You cannot be serious. Alexander, our families arranged our match years ago. Everyone in London society expects us to finally complete what was promised." "Everyone in London society," Alexander said, "expected me to marry for advantage rather than affection, and I refused that expectation 2 years ago at considerable personal cost. I do not intend to reverse that decision, now simply because circumstances have made my refusal more publicly known." Isabel studied him for a long moment, calculation replacing whatever genuine feeling might once have existed between them. "Very well," she said finally, her tone turning cool. "But you should know, Alexander, that society will not so easily accept a duchess with a limp and a scarred face, however sincere your affection for her might be. You are inviting scandal and ridicule into a household that has only just begun recovering from your prolonged absence." "Then society," Alexander said quietly, "will simply have to learn to accept what I have already decided is worth far more than its approval." Isabel left Ravenhall within the hour, her carriage disappearing down the long drive with considerably less grace than it had arrived with. But her words lingered in Alexander's mind long after she had gone, a quiet worry settling over him. He had spent weeks writing to Alina, hoping to repair the damage his deception had caused, but he had not yet considered fully what awaited her should she choose to join him at Ravenhall. The scrutiny, the judgment, the whispers that had already followed her throughout her life in London, now amplified tenfold by the weight of a ducal title. That evening, a letter arrived from Alina, the first reply he had received in 2 months of careful, patient correspondence. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal, uncertain what he might find inside. "I have read every letter you sent," she wrote, "though I confess I was not always ready to respond to them. I have spent these past weeks tending our garden, thinking of the man who taught me to prune roses and mend leaking roofs, and trying to separate that man from the Duke whose title I did not know I had married into. I believe now that I have finally managed to do so. The man I fell in love with was never a disguise, as you told me the night you left. He was simply you, and I find, despite everything, that I miss him terribly." Alexander read the letter 3 times before setting it down, relief and hope warring with the lingering worry Isabel's visit had stirred within him. He picked up his pen immediately and began writing a reply, one that spoke honestly, for the first time, of the challenges that awaited her at Ravenhall, the judgment of society, the whispers that had already begun circulating about his hasty marriage, the visit from Isabel Voss and the expectations she still carried. "I will not pretend the path ahead will be easy," he wrote. "Society has never been kind to those who do not fit its narrow expectations, and I fear my title will not shield you from the same cruel judgments you endured in London, though it may take a different shape here. But I would rather face every whisper and every judgment beside you than remain safely alone within walls that have never truly felt like home. If you are willing, Alina, I would welcome you to Ravenhall not as an obligation fulfilled, but as the choice I have wanted to make since the day I first watched you tending flowers that had been trampled by careless guests." The letter reached Alina 5 days later, delivered by the same writer who had once interrupted their storm-soaked evening with news that changed everything. She read it standing in the garden, roses blooming fully around her despite the autumn chill beginning to settle over the estate, and found herself smiling for the first time in weeks, a genuine, unguarded smile that surprised even her. But the decision before her was not a simple one. To join Alexander at Ravenhall meant leaving behind the small cottage that had become, despite everything, the first place she had ever truly felt at home. It meant facing a society that had already rejected her once, now amplified by the scrutiny that came with a ducal title. It meant trusting a man who had deceived her, however gently, and believing that the honesty he now offered was real rather than another careful performance. She thought of her father's cruelty, of Vincent Colebrook's rejection, of years spent believing herself unworthy of genuine love. And she thought of Alexander's hands, roughened by labor he had never needed to perform, mending their roof simply because it needed mending, teaching her to tend roses simply because he believed she deserved something beautiful to care for. That night, Alina began packing the few belongings she had accumulated during her months at the small cottage, her decision made with a clarity that surprised her. She would go to Ravenhall, not because her father demanded it, not because society expected it, but because she had finally, after 26 years of being told she was unworthy of choice, decided for herself what she wanted her life to become. The following morning, as she prepared to depart, a final visitor arrived at the cottage, one she had not expected and did not welcome. Bernard Whitfield stood in the doorway, his expression carrying none of the earlier excitement he had shown upon learning of Alexander's identity, replaced instead by a strange, unfamiliar hesitance. "I heard you intend to join him at Ravenhall," he said. "I do," Alina replied, continuing to pack without pausing to look at him. "I came to say," Bernard began, then stopped, seeming to search for words that did not come easily. "I came to say that whatever mistakes I have made as your father, whatever cruelty I showed in arranging your marriage out of spite, I did not anticipate this outcome, and I find myself, strangely, glad of it, not for the fortune it might bring our family, but because you appear, for the first time in years, genuinely happy." Alina paused, studying her father carefully, searching for the calculation that had defined every interaction between them for as long as she could remember. She found, to her surprise, something that might have actually been genuine regret. "I do not forgive you, father," she said quietly. "Not yet, and perhaps not for a long while, but I appreciate the honesty, however late it has arrived." Bernard nodded once, understanding, and stepped aside to let her pass. Alina walked out of the small cottage that had witnessed the beginning of an unexpected love, carrying with her nothing more than a small trunk and a heart cautiously, hopefully, opening once more toward a future she had never dared imagine for herself. Ravenhall rose out of the autumn mist like something from a story Alina had once read as a girl, its gray stone towers stretching toward a pale sky, its grounds sprawling far beyond anything she had imagined during Alexander's brief, careful descriptions in his letters. The carriage that had carried her from Whitfield House slowed as it approached the long drive, and Alina felt her heart quicken, not entirely with excitement. Alexander was waiting on the front steps when the carriage finally came to a stop, dressed now in fine clothing befitting his true station, though something in his posture, the slight lean forward, the restless energy in his hands, reminded Alina immediately of the groundsman who had once waited nervously beside her at a small stone chapel. "You came," he said simply, as she stepped down from the carriage, relief and disbelief mingling in his voice. "I told you I would," Alina replied, glancing up at the enormous house looming behind him. "Though I confess, standing here now, I understand rather better why you might have wanted to escape all this, if only for a while." Alexander's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen since his departure. "It does have a way of feeling less like a home, and more like a burden one has been assigned to carry." He offered his arm, and Alina took it, though her eyes remained fixed on the household staff gathered near the entrance, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical as they studied the new Duchess making her way toward them. The first weeks at Ravenhall proved every bit as difficult as Alexander had warned. The staff, though outwardly respectful, carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that Alina could not fail to notice, whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room, glances exchanged between servants who had clearly expected their absent duke to return with a bride of far grander pedigree than a merchant's unmarriageable daughter. Worse still were the visits from neighboring families, arranged under the pretense of welcoming the new Duchess, but carrying, beneath their polished courtesy, the same cruel scrutiny Alina had endured throughout her life in London. She caught the glances directed at her limp as she crossed drawing rooms, overheard the careful, cutting comments about her age and her scarred cheek disguised as innocent observations, endured the pitying smiles of women who clearly believed Alexander's marriage to be some temporary madness that would eventually correct itself. "I do not know that I belong here," Alina admitted to Alexander one evening, several weeks into her new life at Ravenhall, as they sat together in his study, the fire crackling low in the hearth. "The staff watches me as though waiting for me to fail at some test I do not fully understand, and the neighboring families speak to me as though I am a curiosity rather than your wife." "They will learn," Alexander said gently, "as I have already learned, that you belong here more fully than anyone who has ever carried this title before you." "That is a kind sentiment," Alina said, "but kindness does not silence whispers, Alexander. I have spent my entire life being whispered about, and I find the whispers here carry a particular cruelty I had not anticipated, dressed as they are in polite society's careful manners." Alexander considered this for a long moment, then rose from his chair and extended his hand toward her. "Then perhaps," he said, "it is time we stopped waiting for society to accept you, and instead gave them a reason they could not possibly ignore." The following week, Alexander announced a grand dinner at Ravenhall, the first hosted by the estate since his mother's passing, inviting every prominent family within a day's travel, including, much to Alina's surprise, several families from London she recognized immediately as among those who had rejected her most cruelly during her unmarried years. "Why would you invite them?" Alina asked, genuine alarm rising in her chest as she reviewed the guest list Alexander had prepared. "These are the very people who called me unmarriageable, who mocked my limp behind their fans, who taught an entire city to see me as something less than whole." "Precisely," Alexander said, his eyes carrying a quiet, determined confidence. "Because I intend for every single one of them to witness, firsthand, exactly what they overlooked." The evening of the dinner arrived with a nervous energy Alina had not felt since her wedding day, though this time, standing before the mirror in the grand bedroom she now shared with Alexander, she found herself dressed not in a plain gray gown chosen for its unremarkable practicality, but in a deep emerald silk that Alexander had commissioned specifically for the occasion, its color chosen, he told her, to match the very roses she had tended so carefully during their months together at the small cottage. "You look magnificent," Alexander said, appearing in the doorway as she finished dressing, his expression carrying an admiration that had never once wavered since the day he had first watched her from the garden below. "I feel terrified," Alina admitted honestly. "Terrified is allowed," Alexander said, crossing the room to take her hand gently in his. "But know that whatever occurs tonight, whatever whispers or judgments are exchanged behind polite smiles, you will not face them alone, not tonight and not for the rest of our lives together." The dinner that followed unfolded with a tension Alina had anticipated, but had not fully prepared herself for. Conversation flowed carefully around her at first, guests exchanging polite but distant pleasantries, their eyes lingering just long enough on her limp as she crossed the dining hall to remind her exactly how she had once been seen. But as the evening progressed, Alexander made a point of drawing her fully into every conversation, speaking openly of her knowledge of gardening, her thoughtful understanding of literature, her quiet strength during the months they had lived together in modest circumstances neither of them had chosen. It was during the final course, as conversation turned toward the estate's upcoming charitable initiatives, that Alina found her own voice at last, speaking with a passion and clarity that silenced the table entirely. "I have spent my life being told what I could not do because of how I walk, or how I appear," she said, addressing the gathered guests directly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I intend to use whatever position this marriage has granted me to ensure other women, disfigured or disabled or simply different from what society expects, are not made to feel as small as I once did. Ravenhall will support a foundation for exactly that purpose, beginning this very season." A stunned silence followed, broken finally by an elderly countess near the head of the table, a woman whose sharp tongue Alina had feared more than any other guest present that evening. "Well," the countess said slowly, studying Alina with an expression that had shifted, unmistakably, from skepticism to genuine respect, It seems the Duke has chosen rather better than any of us anticipated. The comment broke something loose in the room, conversation resuming with a warmth that had been entirely absent before, and Alina felt, for the first time since arriving at Ravenhall, that she might genuinely belong within its walls after all. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the great house settled into quiet, Alexander found Alina standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the moonlit gardens that stretched toward the horizon. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said, joining her at the railing. "I was terrified tonight," Alina corrected gently, though a smile played at the corner of her mouth. "But I suppose terror and extraordinary are not always so different from one another." Alexander laughed softly, the sound carrying none of the careful restraint he had maintained during his months as a groundsman, free now to be exactly who he was in every sense. "I believe," he said, "that you have spent your entire life being extraordinary, Alina. It simply took the rest of the world considerably longer than it should have to notice." Alina turned to face him fully, the moonlight catching the scar along her jaw that she had once believed made her unworthy of love, and found, standing before this man who had chosen her not for her fortune or her connections, but for the person he had watched quietly for 2 months before ever speaking a word, that she no longer felt the need to hide it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a garden worth tending, even after everything that garden cost us both." "Thank you," Alexander replied, drawing her gently into his arms, "for teaching a man who had everything that the only thing truly worth having was never a title or a fortune at all, but simply someone willing to see him honestly and love him anyway." Above them, the autumn stars scattered across a clear sky, indifferent to titles and fortunes, and the cruel whispers of a society slowly learning to see two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they had never known they were searching for. Winter settled over Ravenhall slowly, frost creeping across the gardens Alina had begun reshaping in her own image. The formal, rigid beds her mother-in-law had once favored giving way gradually to something wilder and more alive. Roses climbing where marble statues had once stood. Wildflowers permitted to grow freely along paths that had previously been kept unnaturally precise. The staff, who had watched her with cautious skepticism during those first difficult weeks, had slowly come to regard her with something closer to genuine affection, won over not by her title, but by her habit of remembering their names, their families, their small daily struggles that the previous Duchess had never once acknowledged. It was in the middle of this settling peace that Isabel Voss made her final attempt, arriving unannounced once more, though this time her carriage carried a companion, a solicitor whose presence suggested her intentions had shifted from persuasion to something considerably more calculated. "I have reviewed the circumstances of your marriage," the solicitor explained to Alexander in the study, Alina seated beside her husband, her spine straight despite the anxiety knotting in her stomach. "Given the haste of the ceremony, the absence of proper documentation regarding your true identity at the time of the vows, there exists a reasonable argument that the marriage itself may be considered improperly contracted." "You are suggesting," Alexander said, his voice carrying a cold precision Alina had rarely heard from him, "that because I concealed my identity during our wedding, the marriage should be dissolved entirely, freeing me to fulfill the engagement my family arranged with Lady Voss 2 years ago." "I am simply presenting the legal possibilities available to you, Your Grace," the solicitor said carefully. Alina felt her chest tighten, old fears rising quickly to the surface, fears that had never fully disappeared despite the warmth of the months that had passed since her arrival at Ravenhall. She had allowed herself to believe, foolishly perhaps, that the difficult chapter of her life had ended, that the whispers and rejections that had defined her existence in London belonged firmly to the past. Isabel's presence, and the calculated legal maneuvering that accompanied it, threatened to unravel that fragile belief entirely. "There are no legal possibilities available to me," Alexander said flatly, rising from his chair, "because I have no interest in dissolving my marriage. Alina is my wife, and she will remain my wife for the whole of my life, regardless of whatever documentation existed or did not exist on the morning of our wedding." "Alexander," Isabel interjected, her voice softening into something that might have once passed for genuine affection, "surely you understand the position this places our families in. The engagement between us was arranged years before your disappearance, formalized through contracts that predate your marriage entirely. Legally speaking." "Legally speaking," Alina interrupted, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "A contract arranged between two families holds considerably less weight than vows exchanged before witnesses and a vicar, regardless of what name was used during their exchange." "I did not marry a name, Lady Voss. I married a man, and that man has chosen, repeatedly and clearly, to remain married to me." Isabel's composed expression finally cracked, irritation flashing openly across her features for the first time since her arrival. "You cannot possibly believe yourself equal to the position you now hold," she said, her voice sharpening. "A merchant's daughter, unmarriageable in London for reasons everyone in this room understands perfectly well, elevated to duchess through nothing more than a cruel joke played by a spiteful father. Do you truly believe yourself capable of fulfilling the responsibilities this title demands?" The room fell silent, the solicitor shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for the direction the conversation had taken. Alina felt the old, familiar sting of judgment rising within her, the same cruel dismissal she had endured for years in London ballrooms, but found, standing now in the study of the home she had come to genuinely love, that the sting no longer carried the power it once had. "I believe," Alina said slowly, rising to stand beside her husband, "that I have spent the past several months establishing a foundation that has already provided support to 11 women across this county alone, women dismissed by society for reasons no different from those once used against me. I believe I have earned the trust of a household staff that initially doubted my worth as thoroughly as you doubt it now. And I believe, Lady Voss, that whatever reasons brought you to Ravenhall today, concern for my capabilities was never truly among them." Isabel stared at her for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed with such calm, unflinching confidence by a woman she had expected to intimidate easily. Finally, she rose, gathering her gloves with sharp, irritated movements. "This is not finished," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than it had upon arrival. "I believe it is," Alexander said quietly, "and has been since the moment I chose to marry Alina rather than honor an arrangement I never wanted. I would ask that you not return to Ravenhall again, Isabel, unless it is to offer genuine goodwill toward my wife rather than schemes designed to unmake our marriage." Isabel left without another word, her solicitor trailing behind her, and the carriage that had arrived with such calculated confidence departed considerably faster than it had come. Alina exhaled slowly once the sound of hooves had faded entirely, the tension that had gripped her chest finally beginning to ease. "That was considerably more frightening than the dinner party," she admitted, sinking back into her chair. "You handled it," Alexander said, kneeling beside her, taking her hands gently in his, "with more grace than anyone in that room deserved. I am sorry, Alina, that my past continues to intrude upon the life we are building together." "Your past is simply part of the man I married," Alina said, offering a tired but genuine smile. "I find I am no longer frightened of it, not truly. I have spent my life being underestimated, Alexander, by my father, by London society, by men who saw only my limp and never bothered to see anything further. I have grown rather accustomed to proving them wrong." Spring arrived at Ravenhall with a warmth that seemed to settle into every corner of the great house. The gardens Alina had reshaped now blooming fully for the first time under her care. The foundation she had established continuing to grow in reputation and reach, welcoming women from across the county who had been dismissed, as she once was, for reasons that had nothing to do with their true worth. It was during this season that Bernard Whitfield returned to Ravenhall, arriving not with the calculated excitement of his earlier visit, but with a genuine humility that surprised Alina considerably more than anything Isabel Voss had attempted. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he said, standing awkwardly in the entrance hall, his fine coat looking somehow smaller than it once had. "I ask only for the chance to know the woman my daughter has become, if you will permit it." Alina studied her father for a long moment, memories of years of cruelty and dismissal warring against the small, genuine regret evident now in his posture. She thought of the girl she had once been, desperate for even a fraction of the acceptance her father had always withheld, and found, standing now as the mistress of Ravenhall, that she no longer needed his approval to know her own worth. "You may visit," she said finally, "on the condition that you treat my husband and this household with the respect you failed to show me for the whole of my life before this marriage. I offer you the chance to build something better between us, Father, not because you have earned it, but because I have decided I am finally strong enough to extend it." Bernard nodded, understanding the boundary being drawn as clearly as the offer being made, and for the first time in Alina's memory, something that resembled genuine gratitude crossed his features. That evening, as the sun set golden over the gardens of Ravenhall, Alina stood beside Alexander on the terrace where he had once told her she was extraordinary, watching the roses she had planted sway gently in the warm spring breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The night you fled Ravenhall, the months you spent as a groundsman, the cruelty of the marriage my father forced upon us both." Alexander considered the question carefully, his hand finding hers in the fading light. "I regret the pain my deception caused you," he said honestly. "But the rest of it, Alina, the leaking roof and the storm and the woman who laughed so freely despite everything, I would relive every difficult moment 1,000 times over, simply to arrive again at this exact evening, standing beside you as exactly who I am, loved for nothing more than that." Alina leaned into him, the scar along her jaw catching the last light of the setting sun, no longer a mark of shame but simply a part of the woman who had finally, after 26 years of being told she was unworthy, found someone who saw her completely, and chose her anyway and would continue choosing her. She knew now with absolute certainty, for every single day that remained of both their lives. The garden around them bloomed in full, unashamed color, exactly as Alina herself had finally learned to do. 5 years passed at Ravenhall, and the gardens Alina had first reshaped in those uncertain early months had grown into something the entire county spoke of with genuine admiration. Roses climbing the old stone walls in colors so rich that visitors often paused simply to stand among them in quiet wonder. The foundation she had established in her first year as Duchess had expanded far beyond its modest beginnings, now supporting dozens of women across 3 counties, offering shelter, education, and opportunity to those society had once dismissed as unworthy of either. Alina often visited the foundation's small offices herself, sitting with young women who arrived nervous and uncertain, listening to their stories with the same patience Alexander had once shown her in a small cottage garden. Their household had grown as well. A daughter, Margaret, born 2 years into their marriage, had inherited her father's careful, thoughtful eyes and her mother's quiet determination, already showing, even at 3 years old, a fierce insistence on tending the garden herself despite her small hands struggling with the larger tools. A son had followed a year later, named Edward in quiet tribute to the man Alexander had briefly been, the groundsman whose gentle patience had first won Alina's trust long before she ever knew the truth of his title. Bernard Whitfield visited Ravenhall regularly now, his relationship with Alina rebuilt slowly and imperfectly over years of small, genuine gestures rather than grand declarations. He had grown fond of his grandchildren, in a way he had never managed with his own daughters, spending long afternoons teaching young Margaret the names of birds that visited the estate's ponds, a softness in him that Alina had never witnessed during her own childhood but chose, for her children's sake, to welcome rather than resent. Isabel Voss had married eventually, a wealthy earl from the north whose fortune, if not his affection, seemed to satisfy her considerably, and her attempts to interfere with Alexander and Alina's marriage had faded quietly into the distant, unpleasant memory of a difficult early chapter neither of them cared to revisit often. Charlotte and Louisa, Alina's younger sisters, had both married respectably in the years following her own unexpected elevation, and though their relationship with Alina remained somewhat distant, shaped by years of quiet neglect during their shared childhood, small threads of genuine connection had begun forming between them, particularly during the holidays when the entire extended family gathered at Ravenhall. Drawn together by children who knew nothing of old grievances and cared only for games played across the sprawling lawns. On a warm summer evening, 5 years to the day since their wedding in the small, undecorated chapel that had begun everything, Alina found Alexander in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of roses that Margaret had insisted on planting herself despite her young age, watching their daughter carefully press seeds into soil with the same intense concentration her father brought to every task he undertook. "She has your patience," Alina observed, settling onto the stone bench nearby, her limp long since accepted by everyone around her as simply another part of who she was, neither hidden nor apologized for. "She has your stubbornness," Alexander countered, smiling as he watched their daughter refuse his offer of help, determined to complete the planting entirely on her own terms. "I suspect she will grow into someone considerably more formidable than either of us." Alina laughed softly, the sound carrying none of the guarded restraint that had once defined her, free now in a way she had never imagined possible during those long, painful years in London, when every door seemed permanently closed against her. "Do you remember," she said, watching the golden evening light settle over the garden they had built together, "the night my father declared me unmarriageable and threatened to hand me to whichever man happened to be standing closest?" "I remember every moment of that time," Alexander said, moving to sit beside her, taking her hand in his as their children continued their careful, determined work among the roses. "I remember watching you from that garden, wondering how the world could possibly fail to see what I saw so clearly, even then." "He did not know he was handing me to a duke," Alina said quietly, "but I have come to believe over these 5 years that it would not have mattered either way. Duke or Groundsman, Alexander, I believe I would have loved you regardless of the name attached to you, simply because of who you chose to be during every quiet, ordinary moment we shared." Alexander lifted her hand gently to his lips, the same tenderness present in the gesture that had first surprised her in a small cottage kitchen years earlier, when a man she believed to be nothing more than a ragged groundsman had brewed her tea and listened, truly listened, to a woman the rest of the world had long ago stopped bothering to hear. "Called unmarriageable," he murmured, "handed to a stranger out of cruelty and spite, and somehow, against every expectation the world held for either of us, we built exactly the life neither of us ever believed we deserved." Above them, the evening sky deepened into soft shades of gold and violet, the roses swaying gently in the warm summer air, and their children's laughter drifted across the garden that had witnessed the entire quiet, unlikely journey of two people who had found, in the most unexpected of circumstances, precisely what they had never known to search for. Alina Whitfield, once called unmarriageable by an entire city that judged her only by a limp and a scar, had become not merely a duchess, but the architect of her own extraordinary life, proof, standing now in a garden blooming beyond anyone's expectations. That worth was never something bestowed by titles or fortunes or the cruel whispers of drawing rooms, but something that had lived within her all along, simply waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to finally see it clearly.